This weekend is Parashat Devarim, the first Parsha in the Book of Devarim, in the Book of Deuteronomy. Rabbis are not clever at naming things, so the first Parsha is called the book name. To just kind of start right out there. But it also happens to be the weekend of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is the anniversary of the destruction of both temples in Jerusalem. It's a day of mourning. It's the only other fast day in the year, full fast day in the year, besides Yom Kippur. So my talk today is going to focus primarily on the Parsha, because that's what we're here for, but I will tie in a little bit of Tisha B'Av at the end. If you think you know where I'm going with it, then feel free to make those guesses to yourself. We'll see how you do. But I want to dive right in here with the Parsha itself. And for those of you that have learned with me before, I'm just going to reset my screen here so I can see everybody's lovely faces and the chat. There we go. For those of you that have learned with me before, you may remember that what I really like to do is make sure that we understand the context of what's happening in our Torah. I think it's very, very important to know not only what we're looking at, but also what's around it. So let's recap just for a moment where we are in Torah. The book of Breshit, the book of Genesis, begins with the creation of, well, everything, and goes all the way through Joseph and the Jewish, the family that will become the Jewish people living in Egypt. At that point, we're not Jews yet. It's just a big old family, about 70 people. Joseph, his 11 brothers, his children, his father, and his sort of household. And we're about 70 people strong living in Egypt. Fast forward 400 years of slavery in Egypt, and the book of Exodus picks up with Moses and goes through the exodus from Egypt, being freed from slavery in Egypt, all the way up to the building of the Mishkan, the building up of the mobile tabernacle, the mobile sort of temple that's going to exist while we're in the desert. Leviticus kind of sidesteps the storyline a little bit. There are some stories in there, but primarily focuses on the laws of the priests and the beginning of ritual Judaism. That's really the point, leaving Egypt and getting these new laws, where the Jewish people as a peoplehood really sort of come into existence. Of course, in the book of Numbers, we get our something that's going to be very, very relevant, which is 40 years of wandering. The Israelites screw up a little bit. If you remember how they screw up, that's coming soon. And they get wandering for 40 years in the desert, and we get all the adventures and things that take place during that time, which leads us up to right now, the book of Devarim. We are on the edge of the land of Canaan. We have been 40 years in the desert. The entire generation, minus 3 people who left Egypt, are gone. It is their children and their children's children who are about to enter into what we now think of as the land of Israel. And Moshe is getting ready to die. Moshe is getting ready to say goodbye to the people. And that's going to be really important. And actually, the entire book of Deuteronomy is Moshe's goodbye speech. And it's very easy when we're reading bits and pieces throughout Devarim, especially when we get later in the book, to forget that this entire book is Moshe's swan song. It's Moshe getting the people ready to be without him. So what happens? We open up. Number 1, I said the rabbis are not good at naming things. Our first 2 words of this book are Eila HaDvarim. These are the Devarim. These are the words or the things. That's where we get the name of the Parsha. That's where we get the name of the book. It's because it's the second word. Eila HaDvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael be'ever hayarden. These are the words that Moshe addressed to all of Israel on the other side of the Jordan, meaning the eastern side of the Jordan. They have to cross the river Jordan in order to get into Canaan, into the land of Israel. And we get a scope of when we are, and in addition to where we are here. It was the 40th year meaning the 40th year from leaving Egypt. On the first day of the 11th month, so getting close to the 41st year there, Diber Moshe el bnei Yisrael kechol asher tziva Adonai oto alehem, that Moshe in this moment is going to address the Israelites and give them all the instructions that Adonai had given Moshe for the people. So our stage is set. Moshe is getting ready to convey the message to the people of what God expects for them, how to be a Jewish people in the land of Israel without him. And what happens for the rest of the Parsha, if we read it straight out of a Tanakh and we just burn through the Hebrew, is a little bit daunting because it's a lot of history. And if you are somebody who's a history buff and you love the nuanced details of what has happened in the past, it's a very exciting Parsha. And if you're the kind of person like myself who has a very difficult time with that many details thrown at me all at once, it can be a bit much. So I'm going to recap it for us. The history that Moshe gives us in this Parsha, right from the bat, starts with God promising a successful journey to Canaan. The people leave Sinai. They got their 10 commandments. They got their laws. They leave Sinai. They're going to the land. At some point, tribal leaders are chosen when they arrive at Canaan to go into the land. And for those of you that remember the story, they come back with awful news. These people that we refer to today as the 12 spies go into the land. They come back, tell Moshe that there's no way they could enter the land of Israel. God gets angry and says, then you can't go in. You're going to wander for 40 years until you're all dead. This is the ultimate betrayal of the people to God. God says your children are going to get to go in. The people backtrack really quickly as soon as they get that punishment. Like, no, it's okay. We'll go in. And God's like, no, I'm not protecting you now. So they try to go in. They get absolutely destroyed. And then they have to run away with their tails between their legs. From there, the Israelites wander, Moshe reminds them, for 38 years until the entire generation who screwed up at the edge of Canaan, the edge of Israel, is dead. So they're reminded that they actually could have been there 40 years earlier, or 38 years earlier, but they screwed up. After that, Moshe lists all of the nations whose land they passed through peacefully on that 38-year journey. And that each nation who they saw, who was living peacefully, who let them pass through, each one of there, Moshe says, was there only because the previous people upset God, and God chose to let the previous nations be wiped out. And so these new nations were there. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? God letting a nation be wiped out in order to let another nation live in a particular area. Interesting theme here. Then we move into the most recent history of Moshe and the Israelites, where King Sichon attacks the Israelites, gets completely destroyed. King Og of Bashan attacks the Israelites and gets completely destroyed. So much so that they capture the land east of the Jordan River. And then the tribes of Reuven, of Reuben, of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh all split up Og's land east of the Jordan River. And in a summary, that's our whole Parsha. It's an entire list of history. None of this is new. If you've been coming every week all year, you've heard every single piece that I just shared before. Why is Moshe repeating? For some of this, like the attacks from King Sichon and King Bashan and King Og, this generation was there. They were the victorious ones. They know it. For some, this generation were children or non-existent at all. When they left Egypt, when they stubbornly had the issue with the spies, when they wandered for the first part of the 38 years. But all of this is history. We've seen this all before. And this is where it gets interesting. Because if we look carefully at some of the way in which Moshe tells this story, we have to ask the question, Did Moshe change history? Did Moshe lie to the Israelites? Did Moshe play historical bias in his recounting? Let's look at two in particular passages. The first is as Moshe recounts the sin of the spies. In verse 20 of the first chapter, Moshe says, "Va'omar aleichem batem ad har ha'emori asher Adonai Eloheinu noten lanu." I said to you, we got to Israel. Woo! Right? We're right here. We're on the edge. We got to the country of the Amorites. God's going to give us this land. Re'ei natan Adonai Elohecha lefanecha et ha'aretz. So look, God has see the land that's in front of you. God has put it in front of you. It's yours for the taking. Ale reish ka'asher diber Adonai Elohei avotecha lach al tirad ve'al techat. Go get it. Don't have any fear. Don't second guess yourself. Go get it. Here's the interesting part. Vatikrivun elai kulchem vatomru nishlecha anashim lefanenu v'yachperu lanu et haaretz. Then all of you Israelites came to me, Moshe, and said, well, hold on. Can we send in some people first? Can we send in some initial individuals? They're going to go in, the Yachperu, and they're going to forage the land for us. They're going to bring us back some food. And then, and then by doing that, they'll tell us sort of the good route to enter the land. That's the scenario Moshe says. The people wanted to send in agents who were just going to forage the land. And then they came back as spies and gave a horrible accounting. How dare they? Well, for those of you that don't remember what happened in the book of Numbers, let's recap it. Because in Parshat Shlach Lecha, in Parshat of the spies, named for this moment, is Numbers chapter 13. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, and Adonai spoke to Moshe, saying, Shlach lecha anashim, vayaturu et eretz Canaan. Moshe, go send people in to scout the land. God gave the command. And not to forage, but to scout, to get some fact-finding mission, to go look at what's going on. What? Moshe was there. Why would he change the story? More than that, we still have at least two people who were alive in that time. Kalev and Yehoshua ben Nun, the two individuals who merited, the two of the 12 spies who merited to go into the land of Israel for coming back with a positive report. So there are people who can corroborate the fact that Moshe changed the story a little bit. What's going on? In fact, he goes on because what Moshe then says in verse 37, Gam bi hitanaf Adonai, biglalchem lemor, gam ata lo tavo sham. Because of you, Israelites, says Moshe, Adonai was mad at me and said that I can't go in because you screwed up with the spies. Anybody remember what actually gave Moshe his punishment for not going in? It was the striking of the rock. It was, I got his temper striking the rock, right? We got this other story. Moshe is flat out blaming the people for something completely different. And then says Yehoshua ben Nun, this was one of the two spies, right, who says, no, it's good, we can do this. Yehoshua ben Nun ha'omed lefanecha. As a result of your mistake, Joshua is going to take over for me. All right, I got some people trying to defend Moshe already. Moshe doesn't lie. He's remembering it differently now. Oh, he's got a different agenda. There's all these different things. Listen, I love it. You guys are spot on here with exactly what the sages are the sages are going to do. They're going to try to make Moshe into the hero here. They don't like the idea of two possible stories, and they're going to actually do it in slightly different ways. And I don't have this on the screen because I'm going to actually disagree with them. But Rashi, good old Rashi, right? 11th century French rabbi and commentator. We love Rashi. Rashi says, no. Shlach lecha. God says, send for yourself. God never wanted the people to send in agents. He just gave them permission if they wanted to. Well, Rashi, how about lech lecha? Surely that was a command. Come on. Is that a little hard pressed, Rashi? I'm not sure I buy that. Chizkuni says here when Moshe is blaming the people for his anger, Chizkuni says, no. It was because of the issue with the spies that Moshe lost his temper. Well, all right. The rabbis are kind of like to this notion of ein mukdamu me'ochar b'Torah. They're trying to, say there's no before or after, everything's out of order. Chizkuni's got to kind of play that game to make that work, kind of ignoring the fact that Moshe's sister just died. Maybe that had something to do with his anger. Right? So the rabbis are going to play this game. They're going to try to figure out what's going here. Perhaps Moshe's feeling a little bitter. I'm sure Moshe's feeling a lot bitter. We can see that real transformation over the course of his lifetime of bitterness. Though some might argue he was always bitter to begin with. No, God, not me. I don't want to go. Maybe Moshe simply couldn't have lived with having disappointed God. Oh, that's so, that breaks my heart. That breaks my heart. Moshe was so flawed and so brokenhearted that he just couldn't bear to blame himself or God. He needed to place blame elsewhere. I love these answers, guys. You're getting really all over the place. And I really, really love this creativity. At an advanced age, memory can be damaged or altered. The only problem with that is the very end of the Torah says that Moshe was not dim in his eyes or in his mind, that Moshe died at 120, having just all of the faculties he always had. So Torah doesn't want to play that game either. But I'm going to propose something a little bit different. I think some people actually hinted at what I'm going to say here as well. But I think in order to understand this, we need to look at the greater context of what's going on. If we do an overview of that list of events that Moshe gave, what's the theme? It starts with the Israelites screw up. God gives them a gift and they reject it. As a result, God stops protecting them. God walks away. God says, I'm not going to be with you. You got 38 years now to wander without me. And that's it. Immediately, the people try to go into the land without God, and they get destroyed. 38 years later, God comes back and says, now is the time. Now the new generation. And what do we end with? The successes against King Sichon and King Og and the capturing of land. We have a very intentional arc. Moshe HaNavi. Oh, wait, that's not what we call him. Moshe HaGadol. No, that's not right either. Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe, our teacher. Why does Moshe get that title? Surely he was a prophet, but we don't call him that. Surely he was great. Our Torah says at the end of Devarim, there was no one greater, but we don't call him that. We call him a teacher because he understands how to take the lesson and convey it to the people. Moshe knew exactly what he was doing when he changed the story. He took the focus that was not relevant. He took the focus of who was really doing what was the order of operations. He ignores the fact that there's different words here. Vayaturu, vayachperu, and Devarim he calls them miraglim. He throws that aside. He says, those are distractions. We're going to sit here and play a blame game. We're going to argue over it. It's not the point. The point is that we have a relationship with God. And when you violate that relationship, God walks away. But not forever. not forever. God will come back, and God will protect, and God will keep the promise that God has made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. And so we get this beautiful arc. And that can be very difficult to hold on to, especially in 2022, this notion that God is willing to actually walk away from a people. And maybe even back then. So Moshe wants to prove it. Moshe says, listen, guys, you're not special because you're somehow better than all the other people in the world. You're not even the first people for God to displace. We have all in verse 16 through 25 of chapter 2, this list of nations who are in the surrounding areas, who were there because of the same treatment the Israelites are about to get. Oh, I love this. Somebody asked the question, did God walk away or was God pushed away? I might argue that sometimes those things are one and the same. But it's a good distinction to make, right? That it wasn't that God wanted to leave. It's that God felt a necessity, that people simply couldn't engage in their side of the relationship before, and what that means to deal with that. And somebody else asked the question, listen, but what of the human suffering before God returns? Yeah, that's a reality. It's very easy to say God is omnibenevolent, and what that means is God would never let bad things happen to anyone who didn't deserve it. But clearly that's not true. We know in the world around us that bad things happen to good people. We know that there's suffering that is not necessary to be in there. And time and time and time again, our Torah acknowledges that part of the natural order of the world is that sometimes bad things happen. What can prevent that is when God is there. So Moshe gives a list of nations who are treated the same way as the Israelites, where God didn't protect the nation that was there, protected a different nation instead. They came in, took over the land, and here they are living peacefully. And Moshe says, listen, this can be us too, if you are willing to build this relationship with God. So let's take a look at something on this theme that is very, very relevant and helps an understanding of not only this story, but of the world around us. There's a story from Midrash Eicha, Lamentations Rabbah, the book that we read. Eicha is the book we read on Tisha B'Av. And the text that I've got on the screen is adapted from a book called Sefer HaAgadah, which is a sort of listing of a lot of the different midrashim and stories throughout the Gemara and various midrashim. And we have a story of the day of the destruction of the first temple. And in that day, the Lord, the God of hosts, called to weeping and to lamentation. This is a quote from the book of Isaiah. When the Holy One was about to destroy the temple, God said, so long as I am within it, the peoples of the world will be unable to touch it. As long as God dwells in the temple, no one can defeat God. However, the temple's got to go. So I will shut my eyes from it and swear that I will have nothing to do with it again until the messianic end of time. Meanwhile, let the enemies come and devastate it. Then God swore by God's right hand and put it behind God's self, as it is said in the book of Lamentations, in the book of Eicha, God put back God's right hand from before the enemy. And at once the enemies entered the temple and burned it. The temple is destroyed. And we get this notion here that it is not that God destroyed the temple. It is not that God was defeated. It was not any of these things, but rather that the only thing that prevents the existence of evil in the world, the only thing that holds back that suffering, that war, that devastation is God. And in this moment, God walks away. And so this is actually revolutionary for the Jewish people. Up to the destruction of the temple, every nation of the world, when their God's temple was destroyed, the mentality was, our God has been defeated, and therefore we're going to vanish. Not for the Jews. The Jews say there's only one God. And therefore, if God's temple was destroyed, it's because God let it happen. That is a painful understanding, and it's an understanding that kept us around in a way that no other ancient civilization has remained. But the Midrash continues, lest you think God is a malicious God. Because after it was burned, the Holy One said, once again, I have no dwelling place in the land. So I shall remove my presence from it and go up to my former residence. The Holy One wept in that moment and said, woe is me. What have I done? For Israel's sake, I caused my presence to dwell below. I was in that temple for Israel. But now that they have violated our relationship, now that they have been the abusive spouse, I am returning to my former place. I'm leaving. I have, heaven forbid, become the laughingstock of the nations and an object of derision for mortals. It was in that instant that the angel of the presence came, fell upon his face, and spoke to God before the Holy One, Master of the universe, let me weep. You don't weep. You be ever powerful. You be ever judgmental. I'll have the emotion. To which God replies, if you don't let me weep, I will go into a place where you can't come, and I'll weep there. That such was God's response is intimated in the verse from Jeremiah, if you cannot bear to hear it, my spirit will weep in the secret place. So what we have is a world in which God, as somebody said, I like that phrasing, was pushed away. And what we have is a moment where God is devastated by it. That God cries too. And that this reality of destruction, this reality of the world we live in, is real. It exists with God in the world. It exists without God in the world. It's a part of the order. And when we fall victim to that, either because of our own doing or because of the evil of someone else, it's painful, it's sad, and we have to acknowledge that despair. Even God cries when evil wins. Now, I realize that there's some major theological implications in what I'm teaching today. And I realize that this has a much more depressing note to it than some of my other parshiot. And there's a reason that Parashat Devarim appears near Tisha B'Av, because so often we want, and you'll hear rabbi after rabbi preach about sinat chinam, and here's how you prevent devastation, and here's how you prevent hatred, and here's how you manage your anger. And yes, those are all great lessons, but it's also sad. We have to cry. We have to be upset. We have to ask God. Now, there's some very, very good questions that are in the chat, and I would be a terrible rabbi if I did not address some of them, because they're the natural questions that are going to come up when somebody says something like what I'm saying right now, which is, what about Ukraine? What about the Holocaust? Is this victim blaming? Are you simply saying that every single bad thing in the world happened because God walked away? What kind of world are we living in? No, I'm not saying any of that. I'm not saying any of that. Because number one, we're talking about one scenario in which we're given the reasons. We're told the relationship. We're told why God left. We are told what we did wrong. And it is our unique relationship with God in that moment that is the story we're talking about. Just because I get into a fight with my wife over doing the dishes does not mean that every other problem in everybody else's relationship is over dishes. Relationships are unique. That's what it means when we call ourselves kadosh. That's what it means to be separate, to be different. It's not greater than, it's not less than. Every nation has to ask themselves what their relationship with God is. Every nation has to ask themselves what their connection to evil and good in the world is. Every nation has to be responsible for their choices, and every single individual has to make it their life's mission to make this world a better place. That's what we're given in our mitzvot. We all have that responsibility, but we also live in a world where sometimes we're going to fail. And that's the lesson of Tisha B'Av, and that's the lesson of God's tears, and that's the lesson that Moshe is trying to impart to the Israelites. Learn from your history. Sometimes we screw up. Sometimes bad things happen. And you know what? Even at the worst of times, when you've shoved God away violently, God's still waiting for the opportunity to come back. I can't tell you when God comes back. I can't tell you when God is gone. I cannot tell you which of life's tragedies are because God wanted them or because God didn't want them, or which good things are because God wanted them or because God didn't want them. I cannot tell you the successes and fails of each individual and each nation because I'm not God. All I can share is the lessons from our Torah that tell us on the saddest day of our year, of our history, we need to learn from our history. We need to seek help from God in those tragedies, not blame God for them. We need to seek love in our lives and not anger and derision, because God is waiting for us to get there as individuals, as a nation, as a greater human civilization. And no message is held greater than that in the national anthem of our country today. In Hatikva, we say the words, Od lo avda tikvatenu. Our hope is not yet lost. Hatikva bat shnot alpayim. It is a hope that is 2,000 years old and counting. That hope that is talked about in the Israeli national anthem is so much more than about having a land. It is about rekindling the love between human beings and the divine. That's the hope. And there's a reason that even after getting our own land, this is still the national anthem. We didn't get Israel and all of a sudden, life is wonderful and we're perfect and everything's great. Because it transcends that. Until there is peace, not only in the land, but in the world, we have to have hope. We have to know that God is waiting for us to come back. And no individual is going to be the one to make that happen. God does not stay and go with the people Israel based on the actions of individuals. They do it. God does it based on the actions of the whole. And we are all part of the whole. I wish I could end this parsha on a happy note, but I think I'd be doing disservice to the saddest day of the year if I did. So instead, I want us to end with the notion that it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be mad at God for not being the divine who sticks with us through thick and thin, who's going to never leave, who's going to make sure that the world is perfect. It's okay to be angry at God. Our rabbis were angry at God for allowing evil in the world. It's okay. You have permission to cry. You have permission to feel that emotion. But then, when Tisha B'Av is over, when we go through the remainder of our Parshiot, when we get to our Chagim, we still move forward in hope, because we know that in the end, eventually, maybe not in our lifetimes, we will succeed, because God is waiting for an opportunity to be with us. Before I end today, I'd love to have a few minutes for questions. If you have to run, by all means, if you enjoyed this learning, or if this learning frustrated you, or if you hated this learning, tell a friend. I appreciate it. I teach all year round, but I'm going to pause here before we actually close for some questions. There are some hands. Julie, do you want to be in charge of calling on people?
Sure, Lois, go ahead.
Yes, I'd just like to say that the president of our synagogue and his family were vacationing near Southampton in New York, and the house caught fire, and they lost their two daughters, 19 and 21. So it's a very sad time for our synagogue.
I am deeply, deeply, deeply sorry for your whole community, especially the family of these two girls and their parents. Zichronah livracha. There's no answer. There's no consolation that one can give in moments like that. It is as tragic can come when a parent loses a child. There is no theology to make that okay. There is no explanation to make that acceptable. There is nothing that our tradition can offer us other than to be there for one another and to know that we have to live in that tragedy while it's there. That we can't just find a reason to make everything okay. And I think that's the lesson of Tisha B'Av as well, that sometimes sadness is not only important, but it's a necessary emotion for us to feel, because bad things happen. And the only reasonable response to that is to feel awful and to try to be there the best we can for one another.
Nina.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for this teaching. I put in a lot of skeptical comments, and I'm finding this sort of perverse experience of the more I learn, the less I believe. So I guess my question is, sort of what do I do with that? I mean, I was in a class recently on Jeremiah, and it just made me so upset, and just feeling like, okay, well, if this is what God sort of bestows upon people, why sort of, if it's on us at the end of the day to choose to be good or evil and make peace or make war, then honestly, why do we need a deity? Why? I have a brother-in-law who's a fabulous human being and an atheist. I have family who are devout Jews and not particularly good people. I'm losing the notion of why God matters to how we behave and what we choose to be in the world. So maybe you could help.
Nina, I really appreciate that question. I really appreciate your honesty there, right? That and I don't think you're alone in that, as you just gave multiple examples. I think there's a lot of people who feel very similarly to you, right? Which is that the more we focus on these negative components of God's relationship with the people and these various stories from our Torah, and the more we learn about some of these traditional pieces, right, it can be very angering, it can be very upsetting, it can be reason to make us sort of push it away a little bit, or a lot of it in some case. There's an analogy that I like to give when I talk about God's role in bettering the world. And the example that I give is, imagine for a moment you've never seen sports of any kind, And all of a sudden, you're walking down the street and you hear this big ruckus from this giant building. And you walk in, and there's all these people sitting in chairs shouting from the sides. And there's a big field, and there's a ball going, and people are kicking the ball, but nobody's touching it except for this one guy. And you start going back. And eventually you learn that it's called a goal, and it's a soccer ball, and these are the rules of the game, and these are the, this, that, and the other. And then eventually you say, you know what, I'm going to try playing this game. This is cool. And it turns out you find out you're amazing at soccer. You're one of the best players that's ever lived. It's incredible, right? To me, that's wandering the world without God. Can you get to a place of absolute moral incredibleness? Can you be an amazing human being because you had the people around you who were great influences, and you were raised well, and you saw evil in the world, and you naturally came into this notion of morality? Absolutely. But where does all of that come from? We have to remember that there's a reason the Torah says don't murder. It's because it wasn't common sense until it was. The very beginning of our stories, Cain and Abel, Lamech, Joseph being sold, being almost killed by his siblings, Abraham to his son Isaac, child sacrifice was normal. Things aren't common sense until they are. God is the source of that common sense. God is the reason that we're given a world in which people understand fundamental truths. God is the reason that we are directed in the positive way. And yes, there's free choice, and yes, there are bad influences, and yes, there is a strained relationship at times, in the same way that we would not give up our parents just because we argued as children. Now, unfortunately, we also live in a world where relationships can be strained to the point of breaking. And I think our relationship with God is no different. When I talk about my relationship with my wife, and when I counsel people on relationships within their own lives, I always say every relationship has three people: me, you, and us. You thought I was going to say God. No, it's me, you, and us. Right? We together are an entity. And at least two of those three people have to be doing well at any given time for the three of us to be sustained. I can't ignore the people in my life and expect them to stick around any more than I can ignore God and expect God to stick around. And God can't ignore me and expect me to stick around any more than anybody else can ignore me and expect me to stick around. It has to work the same way. So yes, there are times in our tradition, there are times in our history where that relationship is strained to the point of breaking. That's Tisha B'Av. That is a broken relationship. So what would it be like if we started to try to build a relationship with God, not on books like Jeremiah, or God forbid, Job, but what would it look like if we started to build relationships with God on books like Vayikra, on books like Shmot, on the little miracles of our everyday lives, on the fact that we were raised by people who lived life's lessons in such a way that here we are today. The fact that we are a miraculous existence to begin with. The fact that babies are born. My sister, my older sister, is a cytogeneticist. She works with testing the genetic material of children before they're born. And she always says to me, the odds of a human child being born healthy are astronomically small. If this was a game of statistics, human beings would not exist. And yet here we are, 7 billion strong. Our tradition gives us ways to connect with God in those positive ways. But we have to be looking for God as a source for that goodness. if we get stuck on every little thing that that person does in our lives, we're going to break the relationship in the same way that if we get stuck on every problem between us and God, we're going to break the relationship. We have time for another, Julie?
Yeah, if you are open to it. We have two hands. We have Anne, and then if we have time, Joanne.
Am I up? I'm Ann.
Go for it, Anne.
Okay, I'm very disturbed by the passage that is chapter 3, lines 32 to 34, where this is regarding Sihon. At that time, we captured all his towns and we doomed every town, men, women, and children, leaving no survivors. It sounds very much like God was advocating genocide.
Yeah. And I would be disturbed if you weren't disturbed, right? That is a disturbing moment in our history. And, you know, our rabbis, and when I say our rabbis, I mean our sages, the lovely authors and voices in the tradition for the last 2,000 years, and these books behind me, they want so badly to believe that our ancestors were perfect. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, these are the pillars of all civilization. They're amazing, right? They did nothing wrong. Really? Abraham tried to sacrifice his kid. Isaac played favorites. Jacob played favorites. Jacob almost lost his whole family, right? Not to mention stories of what happens to Dinah and how their brothers take a vengeance on her. God himself wipes out the whole world in the story of Noah. But God also changes God's mind. Abraham argues for Sodom and Amorah, and God listens. God wants to wipe out the Israelites, and Moshe single-handedly saves them not once but twice. Our ancestors make mistakes. Our history is scary. It's problematic. I would argue here, in these massive moments, it's more often Moshe's doing than God's doing. It's more often the people's doing than God's doing. And I would argue that people make a heck of a lot more mistakes than God does. But yeah, there are some disturbing parts in our Torah. Rather than trying to say, well, why is this a good thing? Let's learn from the mistakes. Let's acknowledge that we don't live a world that halakha today is not Torah living. We've changed, we've adapted, we've adjusted. Why? Because God wanted us to. That's Isaiah. That's Ezekiel. Stop giving me sacrifices. The life you're living is bad. Change your ways. Enough with the sacrifices. So we evolve. We adapt, but we don't throw out our history either, because just like Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher, is teaching us in this week's Parsha, if we don't look back, we won't learn. And be upset by that passage. Yeah, it sure sounds like what Moshe is saying is that God advocated for genocide. Maybe God advocated. It's probably more likely that Moshe advocated, right, at the end of this long, very frustrated, very embittered life. Regardless, there's clearly some genocide going on. Now, we also know they didn't actually go through with that, because we also know that Moses gets mad at the people for not doing that. But yes, be mad at it. I'm mad at it too. And I think that's okay.
Okay, one more if you're willing.
Last one.
Okay, last one. Joanne, go ahead.
Rabbi Yasher Koach, I after many years of being completely attached to the notion that I should never relate to Hashem as having personality traits or human aspects, I came upon this parsha from a different place, and realized that this conversation with the angel, where God cries too, And with your teaching this morning, this becomes the portal for emotional maturity. And emotional maturity is not possible without that place of crying and sadness. And it gave me finally this freedom to not ever blame myself for praying incorrectly, which, who wants shame from the way they pray? And I guess I'm kind of going all over, but it seems to me that it is after the destruction of the temple that we are given a new terrain where it clearly becomes an inside job. And the human experience is kind of like a never-ending dialogue between these two questions. Ayeka, where am I? And Hineni, I am here. And between the way we answer those two questions, I'm just so grateful we have Torah.
Thank you very much, Joanne. That's for your compliments and for sharing. One of the most fundamental teachings that we teach to our itty bitty children is chapter 2 of the book of Genesis. Zachar unekeva bara otam b'tzelem Elohim. We are created in the image of God. So many amazing midrashim. If I had another 3 hours, we could just go through midrashim just on that topic, or what exactly that means. And what we usually teach our children about that is that, therefore, because we're all in God's image, we're all equal. We need to treat each other well. We need to look at one another like we're looking at ourselves, and all of these, love your neighbor as yourself. All these things we connect to that fundamental notion of B'Tselem Elohim, and we forget that the artist is part of the art. We forget that if we are created in the image of God, that we can only be given what God contains, God's self. We get sad because God gets sad. We get angry because God gets angry. We have love because God loves. We have compassion because God has compassion. We are B'Tselem Elohim. We can look at one another and we can see God in each of us. Not just the good stuff, also some of the bad. Also some of the stuff that makes life worth living. Also some of the stuff that leads us to days of despair as much as leads us to the days of greatest joy. So let us live as though we are B'Tselem Elohim. Let us live every day trying to build that relationship stronger so that we don't need to bicker with God, so that we don't need to be angry with God, so that God's not pushed to breaking our relationship with God. And let's use that to build stronger our relationships with one another.